So I want to have a little bit of a deeper discussion than normal about the Disney Star Wars sequel trilogy. I want to really analyze this thing from an objective perspective. This video is going to be targeted towards anybody who either loved or hated these movies. And there's people out there who love two of them but hate the third one, or they love the first and the last one but they don't like the second one, or they don't like any of them. And some people love all three of them. So the reality is, though, that there was no synergy here. It's been talked about to death, not just by me, but by other content creators, other reviewers. There was no synergy with these films. And what I find interesting is that's the one sort of common denominator that everybody who has talked about these movies has said, right? That's the one thing that no matter what their opinion is of the individual film and the quality of each individual movie, they've all pretty much said, they didn't plan shit. And it's been kind of talked about even during the Last Jedi days before Rise of Skywalker came out, that there was no plan and that Abrams had given them sort of three treatments or three, I guess, plot, I guess you can call it like loose plot threads, and Rian Johnson comes in and just changes everything and moves in a different direction, which he had every right to because Kathy Kennedy gave him the power to do so. But to me, like I've said before, it just shows that she's not a very good leader. But when you really break things down, the problems with this trilogy, I feel, beyond just the synergy and the fact they had no plan, is that a lot of times I feel like these movies, and it's not just The Last Jedi, even though I feel like The Last Jedi might be the biggest culprit of this, if you ask me. It's not just that movie, but also the entire trilogy as a whole and the entire direction behind Disney Star Wars for these movies. Not for Mandalorian, because that's great. Not for the upcoming Clone Wars show. I'm talking about just for like these movies. 7, 8, 9, it kind of shows a little bit of a disrespect toward the audience. One thing I've seen people come up with time and time again is, well, don't complain about them not explaining Snoke and they never explained, the Emperor. Well, that's a very dumb argument from somebody who's trying to defend what I feel is very flawed storytelling, okay? What I mean by that is this. The issue with episode 7 is that it is the 7th episode in the Star Wars saga. There are 6 films that precede it. Whether or not you like or hate the prequels is irrelevant. They exist, point blank. And even if you ignore them, even if you don't even consider them canon, which some people don't, it doesn't matter because Force Awakens barely even mentioned anything from the prequel trilogy at all. It was really a nostalgia piece, a throwback movie to the original trilogy because they were afraid of having the Star Wars fans react in a negative way if they went a different direction. It was a safe movie is the way that I kind of describe it. But the problem is that the movie failed to kind of establish the universe within itself. In the first Star Wars movie, A New Hope, you already know what's going on from the opening crawl. It's a period of civil war, right? And there's a rebellion, there's an empire. You don't have to know how the empire got there. You don't have to know the rise of the empire. That, of course, you find out in the prequels. You don't have to know things going into that film because George Lucas did a great job, of course, taking from Akira Kurosawa, of explaining everything within the confines of that film. You find out in that movie what a Jedi is through Obi-Wan Kenobi. You find out what the Force is. You find out the Jedi used to be a thing in the galaxy until they were snuffed out. And Darth Vader, betrayed and murdered Luke Skywalker's father. Of course, that would be retconned later on into it being the same person. And Obi-Wan was just talking to him from a certain point of view. But the point is that the movies don't have to tell you anything more than that. You hear about this Emperor in the first film. You have no idea what a Sith Lord is. If you go back and you watch that first Star Wars movie, right? Try to do this one day as an exercise. Ignore everything else and just watch that as a film. There's no mention of the Sith. There's no mention of, Emperor Palpatine's just the Emperor. Like, for all we know, he might have just been like a regular human. In fact, in some of the old early drafts for the film, he was supposed to be just a regular human. It wasn't until later on that Lucas kind of made him into this sort of like a sorcerer type guy. So, we don't have to know these things. We just know that there's a rebellion, there's an empire. You have a Luke Skywalker character who is, the everyman. You have you have Han Solo, the rogue anti-hero, and you have Princess Leia, the very brave sort of, righteous character of the movie. And then you have Darth Vader, the villain, Obi-Wan Kenobi, the mentor. These archetypes all worked. When you get to the sequel trilogy, the issue is that they drop us right into this new conflict. And the problem is that the old conflict in episode 6 resolved everything so well. Return of the Jedi was the perfect ending to the saga. Vader redeems himself, becomes Anakin one more time, appears as a ghost at the end of the film. Luke saves the galaxy with Vader, both of them together. And of course, Lando, Han, Leia, they all do their part. Chewie, everybody helps out to save the galaxy and to free it from the oppression of the Empire. You know, the word Sith isn't even used in that movie. I don't recall the word Sith even being used in the movies at all, the original trilogy. It was brought up in I believe the novelization brought up the Sith. But we know the Sith definitely existed because they're in some of the early drafts. You know, that the Jedi used to be called the Jedi Bendu in the early drafts too, but that's a different video for another day. But we have episode 7, and I love how it starts by saying, you know, Luke Skywalker has disappeared. So we already know off the hop that Luke is gone. And since he's gone now, the First Order has risen and now feels confident enough to invade the galaxy. That all makes sense, but the problem is they don't ever tell us where the First Order came from. Now, obviously, they do tell us in episode 9, but the problem is that the explanation for it makes even less sense because now we're supposed to believe that Palpatine somehow survived. And to me, it's, you know, again, it goes back to you clearly had no plan. Now looking at the Colin Trevorrow script that had been coming out, we know for sure they had no plan because Colin Trevorrow's direction for episode 9, I feel like, you know, in some ways I like Abrams' movie better, but in other ways I feel like episode 9, the Colin Trevorrow version, the Duel of the Fates, does kind of wrap up the sequel trilogy well, but I feel like overall the story they were trying to tell was, they were trying to accomplish too many things, guys. That's really what it was. They tried to give us a little bit of fan service with the old characters, but also phase them out. They did it in a somewhat disrespectful way. They try to tell us this new compelling story of, you know, the granddaughter of Palpatine and the grandson of Darth Vader. And that's an interesting idea on paper, but there was not enough foreshadowing in the early parts of the trilogy for it to really have a big payoff when we finally found out that she was a Palpatine. There wasn't that much buildup. It was like one or two little hints and that's it. And that's because they have no clue. They had no clue what they were doing. But you know, the issue is also that the movies themselves just don't feel very... One thing about the sequel trilogy is that it doesn't feel very big or grandiose at all. Like, maybe it's the way that Abrams and Rian Johnson, you know, set up their shots. Because Rian Johnson as a director, I think, does a fantastic job. Like, if you watch Knives Out, right? Knives Out has like 4 or 5 set pieces and that's it. Most of the movie takes place in the mansion. And so when he's telling these kind of small stories, I do think Rian Johnson, I think he's good at it. I really do. But Star Wars is so much bigger than that. And I feel like with, you know, with the original trilogy and the prequels, you felt like there was this big intergalactic conflict. You felt like, you know, the Galactic Civil War was a thing, you know, from the Empire chasing after the rebels in the second movie, which they tried to replicate in Last Jedi. People say it was so creative, and yet it was just a rehash of the other stuff. There was nothing really creative about it, except for what they did with Luke, which a lot of people hated. Damn, I'm talking a lot with no breaks. Anyways, it's all coming out, folks. It's all coming out. So basically, you know, the Galactic Civil War, especially the Battle of Endor, felt huge, you know, and they tried to do it in 9 at the end, but it didn't feel as huge, and it also, like, they tried. They had some nice wide shots and things like that, and even though they had that great scene where the entire galaxy comes to help out the rebels, the resistance, it just wasn't... It didn't feel the same. It didn't feel earned. And that's because the movie was so rushed. You know, that final battle in episode 9 should have been close to or mirroring the final battle from The Lord of the Rings, Return of the King. If this is going to be the finale, we want something big. And then if you go over to, you know, the prequel trilogy, especially with episode 3, that feels gigantic. You've got all kinds of different planets. You've got, you know, General Grievous. You've got, you know, this conflict. You know, the Jedi Purge scene, for example, shows so many different planets. You've got the Clone Wars and the Battle of Coruscant at the beginning of the film, and you see like all these, you know, all these ships and all that stuff. And it's a big CGI mess. I mean, it's not the prettiest scene in the history of Star Wars, but I was wanting something like that in these films, and we never really got that. It just didn't feel like this epic space opera. In fact, when you want to talk about like set pieces and epic space operas, the only movie Disney's done that has captured this is freaking Rogue One. Like, the end of Rogue One feels like, okay, this is Star Wars. Like, this feels like something from 1977, 1980, 83. Like, it feels like that. Whereas in these movies, everything just feels so small and there's not enough really going on. And in some ways, there's too much going on. You know, it's kind of funny because when you watch Last Jedi, there's not really much going on. You know, you've got Rey and her sort of thing with with Luke. You've got the First Order chasing down the Resistance, and it's like really slow. It's the slowest chasing in the movie history, they call it. And then you've got the Canto Bight stuff, and they have these really slow scenes with, Finn and Rose on the ship with DJ, and there's interesting stuff in those scenes. Don't get me wrong, like the whole concept of DJ telling Finn, don't pick a side, like that kind of stuff I like that's actually intriguing ideas. The fact that there's planets that are selling weapons to both sides of the war, like that type of stuff I really enjoyed, but it didn't really get picked up on in episode 9 because episode 9 was trying so hard to kind of, fit so much into it that nothing feels really earned, whereas in the original trilogy, when you watch Return of the Jedi, one of the big criticisms that there's not enough of a movie there. In fact, I remember there was talk that, the opening scene with Jabba the Hutt and the rescue of Han Solo takes so long to get through. I mean, Luke could have just gone in there and cut them up and just been out of there. But it was so, that's one of the problems with the movies, that it gets so drawn out when it doesn't need to be. But yeah, so it's like less movie, but when you get past the Jabba the Hutt stuff, from Luke going to Dagobah talking to Yoda, and then the whole Endor stuff, it's a ride. I mean, it's a classic movie all the way to the end. But with episode 9, it's a ride, but it's too much of a ride, And I just feel like it didn't feel like this great. I mean, they tried though. Like, I think Abrams was trying to be unique in having that battle over Exegol. I think the idea of Palpatine shooting lightning up, and frying the ships is like a EU fan's dream type thing. But at the end of the day, people kept saying that the movie felt like fan service, like fan fiction, and it does feel like that. I mean, when you watch episodes 4, 5, and 6, and then you watch 1, 2, and 3, and you are supposed to watch them in that order because Obi-Wan introduces you to the Force in episode 4. He tells you about the Jedi. So when you watch episode 1, episode 4 already planted the seeds. So when you see Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan, you know that what the Jedi are, you know what the Republic is, and that's why this idea that you can watch episodes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 in that order, it doesn't work. It does not work. It's better to watch 4, 5, 6 than 1, 2, 3. Here's the prequel, here's the backstory, here's how the Emperor came to power, which is really that's the main story of the prequels. People say it's the fall of Anakin, and because he's the main character, but when you really think about it, the story is about how the Emperor came to power, and it's not really a story that needed to be told. I know some people aren't going to like that. I'm not bashing the prequels, but the story was not necessary. The original trilogy worked on its own. This story of the prequels is extra, which is why I've said in the past, there's 3 Star Wars movies, everything else is DLC, and when it comes to this trilogy, episode 7, 8, 9, we really didn't need to see that, because I think what people wanted from episode 7, 8, 9 was more adventures of Luke Skywalker, Princess Leia, Han Solo. What happened to them? Did Han and Leia have kids? Did Luke get married? Obviously, he didn't in this canon. In the original Legends canon, he did get married to Mara Jade. You've got sort of people just wondering where these heroic characters that we all love, what happened to them? So there was probably more intrigue going into the sequel trilogy than there was even the prequel trilogy. I feel like with the prequels, it was like, okay, we're getting Star Wars again finally after so many years. With the sequels, it was only about 10 years, right? 2005 was Revenge of the Sith. 2015 was Force Awakens. But that's still a long time. But it wasn't like the original trilogy, which had a whole slew of generations growing up on it, So, to me, I just feel like looking back on things, the sequel trilogy was a misstep from day one. I'm not sure if Abrams was the right director. I think Abrams, and I've said this before, I'm going to give them a break. I think JJ and I think Rian Johnson do love Star Wars. I think JJ more so, because Rian Johnson's movie felt very passive-aggressive towards Star Wars fans and lore, whereas Abrams, I think, loves, him and Chris Terrio, and even Colin, they do love, the lore, the holocrons. We saw Wayfinders, the same thing as a holocron. I think they like that kind of stuff. Kind of what a lot of Star Wars fans dig about that fantasy space opera. But it just didn't really, you could tell it's not by George Lucas. I hate to say it, because the original trilogy has 3 different directors, Lucas, Kirshner, and Richard Marquand, but Lucas was there. I mean, it was still his story. You could tell it was his story. With the prequels, it was, again, his story. So they feel different. Even though the prequels feel very different from the sequels, from the original trilogy, the prequels don't feel different from each other, if that makes sense. You know, even though I think Revenge of the Sith is the best of the prequels, it's the most... Revenge of the Sith is the closest they came to really capturing the original magic of Star Wars, in my opinion, like the original 3. Like, that's the one that everybody seems to love, and with good reason. It's not just the action. It feels the most like Star Wars. Even though episodes 1 and 2 have a lot of Star Wars in them, don't get me wrong, 3 felt like the closest connective tissue to episode 4, even though episode 4 was like decades, 19 years, I think after episode 3. So, but it still felt like Star Wars, whereas... 7, 8, and 9 is, again, 30 years, another gap. I think it's 33 years. But it just felt very, it felt like Star Wars, but only aesthetically, right? And it was almost kind of boring in a way. Like, you would think that the galaxy would have evolved in 30 years. And I know we have faster X-Wings and faster TIE Fighters, but we've got X-Wings and TIE Fighters. And this is why I am that's why I am looking forward to the High Republic movies that they're going to come out with, because it's going to be different ships, different Jedi, different characters, 400 years in the past. And I think now they can really reinvent the wheel and give us a Star Wars, something that feels like Star Wars from a different time period, an even longer time ago in a galaxy far, far away. And I think it's a good move. And if they have the right creative vision, they could at least give us some good movies. But unfortunately, the way it stands now in this post-mortem video, the sequel trilogy, as I predicted, is a wash. I mean, as a connective film, if you watch them individually, right? I love The Force Awakens. I don't like Last Jedi, even though there are things I do like about it. I don't like the movie overall. And actually, I just got done watching Rise of Skywalker again today, and I don't really hate it as much as I did when I first watched it, but I have this sort of post-mortem feeling where I'm like, damn, this trilogy sucked. Like, as a trilogy, it just doesn't work. Like, it doesn't work as a trilogy. Individual films, like, the Rey, the Star Wars story or whatever, sure, fine. They feel like 3 different movies. It's funny because Rise of Skywalker is a lot like Force Awakens, but it doesn't even feel like Force Awakens, except for a couple of parts here and there. It's almost like it doesn't even feel like an Abrams movie in some cases, and I know there's talk that, they went behind his back and re-edited the film and all that. There's no proof of that, even though that stuff does happen more often than you can think of in the industry. It's one of those things where it makes me sad. Like, it makes me sad that whenever, let's say one day I have kids and they want to watch Star Wars and we watch the old stuff and then we get to this trilogy, it's like, well, don't worry about those movies. They're really not. Just read this, and I just give them like the Thrawn trilogy or something. This is what really happened. Like, I don't want to be that guy, but there's a lot of Star Wars fans who are like that now, and they're not bad people. It's just that they don't like what they did to our characters, and I hate to say it, but Carrie Fisher passing away sucks, and that really did affect the 9th movie, because the Colin Trevorrow version of the events, I think in some ways would have been great for Carrie Fisher. Like, seeing her in that movie, the one that Colin Trevorrow wrote, I think would have been fantastic. I think that Carrie Fisher would have nailed it. I think Princess Leia would have had a great ending in that film. And I just feel like, it's sad. It's really sad. So this will be a hard one to get over. I know I sound like a bitch right now. I'm not trying to be a bitch, but I love Star Wars, and this is going to be a tough one to really wrap my head around in the coming years. I wanted this to be more than it was, and I don't know if Mark Hamill will ever play Luke Skywalker again, dude, and we're just never going to get the Luke that we got before, so all we can do is just rewatch the old trilogy and just enjoy that. Anyways, that's it, at least for Luke Skywalker stuff. I just hope that the Star Wars goes in a different direction now, completely. Mandalorian sounds good. Clone Wars, the cartoon, I trust Filoni on that one, but the sequel trilogy, episode 7, 8, and 9, what I was really excited about back in 2015, and even after Force Awakens, really hyped up to see where the saga would go, just got over like a fart in church. And it's unfortunate. Like, it's really unfortunate. It really is. Because it's just a sequel to the Star Wars trilogy is what this was. A actual continuation of what we had before. And it's a wash, man. It's like there's nothing really, they didn't take it any new directions, I don't feel. And I don't feel like the characters they introduced, even though I like them when they're together in the early parts of Rise of Skywalker, it just doesn't work the same way as the original characters. And it's not the acting, because the actors who play these parts are great. It's just that the story, the plot just didn't work. It just didn't work, and it was too derivative, and just, it's like these guys who made these movies are fans of Star Wars, but I don't feel like they understand Star Wars. And I'm not saying that I do. I'm not saying that I do, even though I feel like I do. We all feel like we do. I think they missed the boat. I think that they missed the fundamental, they missed some of the things that made Star Wars what it is, and they had 3 movies to do it, and they didn't get it right. And that sucks. So, it is what it is. Thank you for watching, and we'll talk soon.